Hi, my name's Fred Zout. I'm a retired geologist living in Pittsburgh and a bicyclist. And I'm planning to offer with Venture Outdoors and Earth Science Excursions LLC a bike ride on the highest part of the Great Allegheny Passage on June 16th, 2021. This video is meant to give some background to the cyclists and any cyclists on the Gap who might be interested in learning a little bit about the relationship between landscapes and the underlying geology. So let me get this thing going here with sharing a screen. Here we go. There's the screen. And we'll maximize. Good. This is a picture from along the route we'll cycle. You really feel like you're on top of the world in the highest part of the Gap, up there with the windmills. And it's a rail trail, nice, fine crushed limestone, very well maintained. It's a great place to cycle. Our objectives in the excursion are for everyone to stay safe, to experience this amazing part of Great Rail Trail, and to learn a little bit about how the landscapes are formed, why they are the shapes they are, and how that's caused by the geology. The outline of this presentation will have a little background on the Great Allegheny Passage. Then we'll talk about the Eastern Continental Divide, relate the landscapes in the region to the underlying geology with a special focus on the Allegheny Front, which we'll also cross in addition to the Eastern Continental Divide. And the last couple slides in the main deck here talk about other Venture Outdoors excursions with geology themes. There are two other peak cycling excursions we have in mind. There's a map that shows where those are. Those are planned in October. And there are 4 hikes, geology hikes that we have in mind in Western Pennsylvania, 3 to waterfalls and 1 to the Erie Lakeshore. Again, those will be shown on maps, and the dates for those will be shown at the end of this presentation. And they're also on the Venture Outdoors website. Here's a map of the Great Allegheny Passage from gaptrail.org. It's 150 miles from Pittsburgh to Cumberland. The first section opened as a Gap section in 1986. The last major segment of it, the celebration of the opening, was in 2015. Most of it's rail trail, so most of it's really a very gentle grade, fairly flat. The rail lines incorporated into it are the Baltimore and Ohio, Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, and Western Maryland. And most of this is maintained by local volunteer groups who do just a great job. It's very well maintained. There's a picture of a segment of it in the route that we'll cycle, June 16th. You can see how well maintained this is, relatively flat, beautiful rail trail. Again, you feel like you're on top of the world there. And here's why. The red line shows the little segment we'll cycle, 3 miles out and 3 miles back, a total of 6 miles on the very peak of the Great Allegheny Passage. This is an elevation profile. The scale is 500 feet between divisions. You go from 720 feet here to the west at Pittsburgh, up to the Eastern Continental Divide, 2,392 feet, and then down to Cumberland, which is the boundary between the Great Allegheny Passage and the C&O Canal towpath. The C&O then follows the route of the Potomac, which is a much lower gradient. So here's the location of the Eastern Continental Divide, and also it's the location of the Allegheny Front when we talk about the geology in a few minutes. Just a great place to be. Here's a map of big drainage divides, major drainage divides in North America. The Eastern Continental Divide, shown in gold, is one of those, one of the major continental scale divides. Here's southern Pennsylvania, where our excursion will be. This divide separates rivers that drain into the Atlantic versus ones that drain into the Gulf of Mexico first, before the Atlantic. And then the red line is the Great Divide, the biggest one on the continent, but this is certainly a very important one. And this is a picture at the Eastern Continental Divide on the Great Allegheny Passage. You can see what a great path it is. This is a picture from late spring. Most pictures are taken from the outside of the portal, which has some writing on it, but This is an invitation to the trail that we'll cycle. Here's a map of watersheds in the lower 48 of the US. The big Mississippi River watershed is in the lavender color here. Here's where our excursion will be, on the boundary between that and the drainages that go off directly into the Atlantic to the east. And a closer view of those drainages going off to the east. Again, the star indicates where our excursion will be. And this is the Chesapeake Bay Watershed. We'll actually, once we cross the Continental Divide, or the Eastern Continental Divide, and get into the eastern watersheds, we'll actually be in streams that drain into the Potomac River. A lot of Pennsylvania is drained by the Susquehanna, as you can see here, but where we'll be is in a drainage of the Potomac. Here's an elevation map of the Pennsylvania and surrounding states. The colors indicate elevation. You can see the key here. The higher elevations are in red, the low elevations in green. And there's a huge change in the landscapes here. The patterns of the hills and the valleys change tremendously across this area. From a lake plain on Lake Erie, a fairly flat area that goes a few miles inland of the lake. Lake Erie has been both higher and lower than today. There are perched beach ridges, and it's a fairly flat plain a few miles in from the lake. Similarly, the coastal plain here in New Jersey, current sea level, past sea levels have been both higher and lower than today. There are perched beach ridges there too, where sea level's been higher. So a fairly flat area with relatively young sediments underneath it. And in between those areas are strongly erosional landscapes. The area where Pittsburgh is, shown here where the cursor's indicating, was buried something like 7, 8, maybe 10,000 feet deeper than today, buried by rock and sediment that's all been eroded away and washed off to ocean basins. Similarly, in eastern Pennsylvania, there once was something like 15,000 plus feet of sediment and rock on top of the current surface. So that sediment's all been worn away, eroded off, and deposited in ocean basins. So what we're seeing at the surface today really is the geology. It was in the subsurface in the past. Here where Pittsburgh is, in the low plateau, the rock layers, sedimentary rock layers, are fairly flat lying. There's no real preferred orientation to the river drainages. They go every which direction. Here's the Monongahela, the Allegheny, the Ohio River. Lots of irregular or a dendritic drainage pattern, like the back veins on the back of a leaf. Here in the Fold Belt or the Valley and Ridge Province in central Pennsylvania, much more organized drainage pattern, long ridges held up by sandstones that have lots of quartz in them, that's very resistant to erosion, versus valleys that are underlain by limestones that dissolve in rainwater, and shales that have a lot of clay, so they're easily eroded. So these highlands then are resistant to erosion in this strongly erosional landscape. They're the more resistant layers to erosion, typically the quartz-rich sandstones versus the valleys being clay-rich shales and limestones. This is the root of an ancient mountain belt that was once as high as the Andes here in southeastern Pennsylvania, and now is worn down to its roots. The continental scale compression here buckled and folded rock layers, again, that have been planed down and worn down to their roots. And you'll see how these long ridges and valleys relate to the compression. But in front of the intensely deformed fold belt, you can see broad folds where sandstones hold up broad ridges. This is Chestnut Ridge, there's Laurel Hill, the Ligonier Valley, which also has Ohio Pile in it down here, is in the valley in between those. This is an upward fold, a downward fold in between, another upward fold held up by quartz-rich, resistant to erosion sandstones. Broad folds in front of the more intensely deformed fold belt. There are low folds in the low plateau also, but they're not nearly as high in amplitude as Chestnut Ridge and Laurel Hill, and certainly not as big as the folds in the fold belt. Again, there's our excursion. We're at the transition between the plateau and the Valley and Ridge or the fold belt here. This is the Allegheny Front. This part of the landscape is the Allegheny Front, separating those two landscape provinces and styles of hills and valleys. This is a geologic map of Pennsylvania. It's a pretty detailed one. The color layers on this are different ages of rock, going from a younger layer, still pretty old, but a younger layer, Permian in age here in Greene County, through Devonian rock layers, much older, hundreds of millions of years old, here in northeastern Pennsylvania. So the different layers are different colors on this. You can see the broad folds in the high plateau. There are some older rock layers exposed in the cores of those upward folds. Look at all the colors in the fold belt. Lots of different ages of rock, including much older layers exposed there than are exposed in the plateau. And here's a cross section, DD prime at the bottom. It's a 1-to-1 scale cross section. There's no vertical exaggeration to make the folds appear bigger. For scale, the level of the Marcellus in the low plateau, about 7,000 feet, give or take 1,000 feet, gives you an idea of the scale of this. There's Chestnut Ridge. It's a prominent fold at the surface. At this scale, it doesn't look all that big. There's Laurel Hill. And here you can see the folds in the fold belt, bringing much older rock layers up to the surface. The style of compression, you can think of this like a carpet on a hardwood floor. If you push the carpet, it buckles, bunches up, and that's the style of folding here, with a detachment down deep in a weak shale layer, which rises up right around the location of the Allegheny Front. It rises up to a higher level detachment. And that's why the Allegheny Front is located where it is, and why there are much older rock layers exposed at the surface in central Pennsylvania than there are in western Pennsylvania. And again, we're right at the edge of the Allegheny Front, as well as the Eastern Continental Divide, a very special place. The rocks in the area we'll cycle are Devonian to Pennsylvanian in age, 370 million years or so to about 300 million years. That's pretty old, and that's a pretty long time, tens of millions of years. But in the whole scheme of things in Earth history, not that much, Earth being over 4.5 billion years old. In this chart, age of rocks from older at the bottom to younger at the top is shown. It's a general cross section from west to east across Pennsylvania. And the colors this time, instead of indicating the age, indicate the type of rock. The yellows being sandstones, typically rich in quartz, some of them very resistant to erosion, like this Silurian sandstone we'll talk about later. Another color on here, the dark blue, those are limestones, great for agriculture. At this time, central Pennsylvania was on a continental margin. There were thick limestones deposited. In the upper Devonian, there's a mix of sandstones, continental shales, and offshore shales, along with some thin limestones, but a real mix of lithologies in the area where we'll be. In the Pennsylvanian rocks, Mississippi and Pennsylvanian, in the rest of the world, those are called carboniferous because there are so many coal layers. Those are the black layers here. The dark gray layers down in this part of the chart are organic rich marine shales. There's the Utica, for example. The Marcellus is here as well. But these are coals, these black layers. This is a zone of a lot of sandstones in the bottom part of the Pennsylvanian era. And those tend to form ridges too and be resistant to erosion. So those are some of the rock units that we'll talk about when we talk about the relationship between the geology and the landscapes. This is a more generalized geologic map. I mentioned Permian age rocks down here in Greene County, going to Devonian rocks in northeastern Pennsylvania. You can see the cores of those broad folds expose older rocks in the centers of those upward folds. There's our field trip location, or cycling excursion location, the boundary between the plateau and the fold belt along the Allegheny Front. And here in the fold belt, you can see these purple, the dark purple are Silurian age rocks, including that prominent sandstone I mentioned, very resistant to erosion, forms ridges. The lavender color is Ordovician. Ordovician includes both shales and limestones, those limestones that are so great for agriculture. what we'll do now is look at a satellite image from this part of the map in southern Bedford County, not far away from where we'll be. And we're going to move from that to look at a satellite image of exactly where we'll be. So here's a satellite image. This is the location that we just saw on the geologic map. And when you look really closely, you can see these long ridges with very even tops to them, held up by Silurian sandstone. It's very rocky, not much soil, woods there, not great for agriculture. This is a limestone valley. This is Ordovician limestone, creating soils that buffer the acid that plants would create as their plant matter decays. It buffers that and also adds some nutrients, some natural fertilizers. This side of the satellite image, there are Devonian shales, sandstones, and limestones at the surface. So there's some farming, but it's not as great for agriculture as this area where there's wall-to-wall farms. I think you might be able to guess from this that on the other side of this broad fold, there's Silurian sandstone, but then there's Devonian over here as well. See how it has a similar land use to the Devonian there. And if we look at other parts of the map and look for areas of wall-to-wall farms, I think you'll be able to pick out some of the other valleys in Pennsylvania that have this Ordovician limestone-based soils like these valleys in this part of central Pennsylvania. So the underlying geology has everything to do with not only the shape of the land, but the land use as well. Now we'll look at a slightly bigger area. We just looked at this valley in southern Bedford County. Here is the start of our excursion, and our excursion is going to be in this area right through here. And you can see this sort of pattern of land use is pretty similar to that. And so is this pattern, pretty similar. These are actually the same age rocks as those Devonian rocks. These have a similar mix of lithologies, although they're younger rocks than Devonian. And these ridges, these ridges, we talked about Silurian sandstones. This is a Silurian sandstone holding that ridge up too. But these are Carboniferous sandstones, or mostly Pennsylvanian sandstones holding up these ridges, so younger. An even closer view, here's our start. There's the Eastern Continental Divide. We'll go through a really neat railroad tunnel, the Big Savage Tunnel. You see a picture of that. Pop out, have a great view to the east from the Allegheny Front, looking off into the fold belt, and then head back. So it's a 6-mile round trip. There's another picture of the Eastern Continental Divide portal that I mentioned before. The inside of the Big Savage Tunnel, it's well lit. It's nice to have bike lights, but it is well lit inside. And one of the portals, when you pop out of the portal on the east, this is the view that you see, and you get an indication of the view that you're going to get when you move up just a little bit farther along the trail. You have this great view off into the Valley and Ridge province from the Allegheny Front here. So it's just a great place to cycle. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the other venture outdoor excursions that are coming up. This is the one we just talked about. It's the peak of the Great Allegheny Passage. In October, I've cycled many of the rail trails in Western Pennsylvania, not all of them, but my very favorite one I want to share with people is a segment of the Allegheny River Trail north of Emlenton, just north of Interstate 80. It's asphalt paved. There are sweeping bends in the Allegheny River Valley there. You go along the river. It's just a great trail. So we'll do a segment of that. I have in mind for us to walk up a side valley from the trail and visit a waterfall along the way. So here you see one of these sweeping bends in the Allegheny River. Also in October, the day before the full moon, actually, moon will be pretty full. I have in mind to share with people the best viewpoints I know of along the Allegheny River across from downtown Pittsburgh. They're just great places to take pictures of the city. And then those are pictures that you've already seen from the Great Allegheny Passage. So those are coming up through Venture Outdoors. And I've already led this series of hikes, and we've decided to repeat them. I led them earlier this year, but repeating them. There are 3 with waterfall themes. So we'll get to learn a little bit of geology and landscape and landforms and why waterfalls form where they do. The first of them is coming up in June at Fall Run in Shaler. You can see a picture of the waterfall at Fall Run Park. It's a great place to learn about evolution of landscapes. Then we're going to go to Buttermilk Falls in Beaver County, the White Star. The picture there is from the winter. It's great in all seasons. It's one of the waterfalls where you can, if you're a little bit agile and you're okay with negotiating around rocks, you can go underneath the waterfall. And this is a picture taken from the far side of it. It's a very easy access location, just a minute off the Pennsylvania Turnpike, exit 13. And it's a short hike from the parking area to the waterfall. But we'll get to learn a little bit about the geology there, and it's just a great place to go. The next one is in September. It's at Ohiopyle. You can see the picture of Ohiopyle Falls here, and also a picture at Entrance Rapids. We'll go a couple other places there. Some really neat places to go, see some rocks, be outdoors, and just enjoy the landscapes. And then the last of them in September is up at Erie Bluff State Park on the lakeshore, where waves wash glacier-carried cobbles and pebbles out of the lakeshore bluffs, which are glacial deposits. And those are on the beach. And they're carried from as far away as way up in Canada. So it's a wide variety of rock types. High-grade metamorphic rocks, igneous rocks like granites. There are limestones with fossils. And then there are more local rocks, lots of sandstones there. But it's a great place for rock collecting, and it's a great place to have an excuse to get outside. And Erie Bluff State Park has a savanna habitat, forest habitat, and this lakeshore. It's just a really neat place to be. So those are the hikes that we have coming up in this what are called Rocks and Waterfalls series. Those are the slides I had in mind to share. I'll just give you a little background about myself here. I grew up in Bethel Park. I have roots in Somerset County, actually, not super far from where we'll be. In fact, we'll see a town that some of my ancestors lived in. I'm a geologist from Bethel. I went to MIT and got a PhD at Princeton. Then I went and worked for ExxonMobil for 30 years. I've been married since '82 to another Bethel Parker. We have 4 kids and 4 grandkids. We've lived in a few different places. I've done a total of more than 2 years of geology field work, lots of teaching of geology field classes too. Came back to Pittsburgh in 2015. We live on Mount Washington. I've got certified as a league cycling instructor, and I like to volunteer and ride with charity bike rides. I also visit high school classes and groups of adults and talk about energy, climate, and Pennsylvania geology. The climate talk is probably the most popular one. That's something people really want to be hearing about these days from an earth scientist. I founded Earth Science Excursions to run these trips. I ginned up a STEM and cycling curriculum, which we're going to teach in Adventure Outdoors summer camp for middle school kids. I've taught kids already with it, and we have some plans for other uses for that too. I've done some cross-country bike rides. The black line is the northern tier. I rode from Maine to Seattle in 2017 with a Bike the US for MS group. I also did a segment of it in 2019 from Maine to Cleveland. I could only spare 2.5 weeks that time. The gray from Virginia to San Francisco is the Trans Am route. I helped lead that group with Bike the US for MS in 2018. I've done a couple of weekend bike rides for Bike MS, Houston to Austin, and the Escape ride that goes up to Lake Erie, north of Pittsburgh. I've done the Pittsburgh to DC Gap and C&O. I also did a solo self-supported ride from Pittsburgh to Blacksburg. That's the bottom of the black line there, a 500-mile ride, partly on the Gap and C&O and partly down the Shenandoah Valley, which was beautiful. And also did a 2-day segment with the Atlantic Coast Bike the US for MS group. I'd intended in 2020 to do a loop around the whole perimeter of the US, a 6-month loop, but that all went away. And you'll see that when I made this slide and picked what I thought were some of the most interesting and beautiful photographs, you'll notice that one of them is where we're going to go. It's that portal I showed you at the Eastern Continental Divide on the Gap Trail. I've led geology and cycling excursion with Friends of the Riverfront. Led a couple of them for friends in Pittsburgh. As I mentioned, I like speaking in high school science classes and with groups of adults. I've led a geology day for Pennsylvania Master Naturalist classes for the last few years, two in Allegheny County. One was for people in a West Washington County class, and actually took them to West Virginia to see a spectacular outcrop across the river from Wellsburg. And I've mentioned the STEM and cycling, developed that curriculum working with people in the Ruach Bicycle Club here in Pittsburgh. So I hope that gives you some background on the trip and a little bit of background about me. And I look forward to seeing you. I hope to see you on June 16th. There we go.